All right, I have 2 o'clock on my end. So I just want to say good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us and continuing to join us on our legislative contact team trainings. In August, we kicked off our training sessions diving into building off of our existing relationships that we have and building new relationships in the virtual environment that we're living in. And last month, during our GA orientation, we learned the most effective ways to share our stories with legislators. Today, we'll be learning some more strategies that we can use to engage with our elected officials. I hope that these training sessions are helpful to y'all as we prepare for the legislative session that starts in January. I have a few housekeeping items before I introduce our speakers. We have 2 more sessions for our legislative contact team training. So mark your calendars. The next session is next Wednesday, December 9th at 2 p.m. Central Time. And then one after the holidays on Wednesday, January 6th, also at 2 p.m. Central Time. After this session, you'll be receiving a link to sign up for next week's session. And on that registration page, please type in your mailing address where I can mail you an item to gift to your legislator before the legislative session starts. We'd like our key contacts to reach out to them and give our legislators the 100-year book. This will be a great way for you to have a point of touch with your member before we get busy during the legislative session. I'll have a few more details on this via email, so be on the lookout for that. And lastly, throughout this training, if you have any questions, please ask them via the Q&A box at any moment so we can answer questions you might have. Joining us today, we have Brad Fitch, which if you've attended any of our past sessions, you've gotten to know Brad and his expertise. Brad is the president and CEO of Congressional Management Foundation. He started his communications career at the age of 16, working in the local AM radio station as a disc jockey and reporter. After graduate school, he worked in television in Washington before moving on to Capitol Hill for 13 years as press secretary, legislative director, and chief of staff. In 2001, he served as deputy director of CMF before leaving in 2006 to form a successful internet startup and returning to CMF in 2010. Brad is frequently quoted in national media outlets on how Congress works and is the author of Citizens Handbook to Influencing Elected Officials and Media Relations Handbook for Agencies, Associations, Nonprofits, and Congress. Also joining us today is Seth Turner. Seth is the Director of Citizens Engagement, where he oversees CMF's effort to improve engagement between citizens and Congress. Since coming to CMF in 2016, he has directed its advocacy training initiatives, including Partnership for a More Perfect Union, which provides participating advocacy organizations with resources, tools, and training programs to promote and inform meaningful civic engagement between their citizen supporters and congressional offices. From 1994 through 2006, Seth served in national nonprofit organizations as public policy and advocacy professional. Most recently, Seth was with Goodwill Industries International's Senior Director of Government Affairs and Public Policy. Welcome, y'all, and thank you for being here with us today, Seth and Brad.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity again to address everyone. One of the pieces of the bio that I don't think even Joanna knows is my first job out of college here in Washington, D.C. was working as a television reporter for stations based in Texas. So I was on TV in El Paso, Midland, Corpus Christi, and when I was lucky, San Antonio. So I got to know your legislators very well during my first few years here in Washington, D.C. And that was sort of my start, my education of how citizens have such a significant impact on elected officials. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to walk you through what we're calling the Complete Citizen Advocates Toolkit. This is based on research that the Congressional Management Foundation has done over the last few years to understand what sort of tools citizens have available to you. I know that it's actually quite daunting, that you think that you really don't have a lot of influence over decisions that are made in Washington or in your state capital. But in fact, there are a lot of tools, basic tools, that you can utilize to influence legislative content and get the attention of lawmakers. To give you an example, here's just a few tools that other people have used to try to influence the legislative process. The following have been sent to Capitol Hill: a brick, a live chicken, and a pile of dog poo. Yes, these have all been used to petition the government for redress of grievances. Folks, this, by the way, is not part of the instructional part of today's program. We don't want you to practice that, but we do want you to recognize that these are various things that people have used to try to influence legislative outcomes. And we're going to share with you here today a little bit of what people are using. And of course, as we have done in previous programs, we are going to put this in the context of the coronavirus and how many legislators and staffers are working remotely. So we're going to be sharing with you recent research that we've done, some of which we shared in the program in November. And some of this content, just a little bit for those of us that joined the program in August, will be a repeat, but I'm only repeating it for emphasis. I want to make sure you capture those messages, and especially since now that you're going to be engaging lawmakers in your state capital and in national capital next month. We want to make sure you've learned some of the really good lessons that we've been talking about since the beginning. So we're just going to put this a little in context, how Washington works. A few years ago, the Congressional Management Foundation was trying to identify what would be a comparable environment on Capitol Hill. And what we decided was it's a lot like an emergency room. And in an emergency room, you've got a lot of young people who haven't worked in a lot of other jobs, working really long hours and making decisions that affect people's lives. And about 15 years ago, it got a real shock to the system when Al Gore invented the internet. That's a very bad picture of Al. I feel bad about that. By the way, he didn't really say that. Look it up. It's a little derivation. Anyway, the point is that the internet changed the economics of advocacy. Prior to 2000, the late 90s, if you wanted to communicate to Capitol Hill, you needed stamps, you needed postcards, you needed envelopes, you needed to pay for postage, you needed to pay for printing. The internet changed the economics of advocacy, and we saw an explosion in grassroots advocacy using online tools and the internet. And in addition to that, what we see is when Congress starts getting active and when we have a new administration, there is a significant uptick in the total volume of communications going to Capitol Hill. Let me just give you one case study example. We looked at one Senate office, the office of Senator Bob Casey of Pennsylvania. In 2016, the Casey office got 1,000 emails on the topic of education. Now, in 2017, you remember, of course, that President Trump was inaugurated and he nominated Betsy DeVos to be Secretary of Education. That was a very controversial post, and a lot of people wrote their members of Congress, including the people of Pennsylvania. In January of 17, the Casey office got 45,000 emails on education. When the Congressional Management Foundation has studied new presidents coming into office in 2009 and 2017, we see a significant increase in volume of communications coming in. Here's one case study we haven't shared with you before. We looked at one House congressional office and the total number of email messages and postal letters coming in 1 year. In 2001, this office received 9,300 letters and emails. By 2011, 48,000. And by 2017, 123,000. So part of the message of this program is you have to diversify the tools that you use. You can't just rely on identical mass email campaigns, which increasingly are frankly running into disfavor on Capitol Hill and in state capitals. They just don't have the bandwidth to respond to all these communications. And yet we do know that more robust interactions are actually influential. Some of you might remember this chart from August that we shared with you in this survey we did of congressional staff, in which we asked this question: if your member or senator is not already arrived at a firm decision on an issue, how much influence might the following advocacy strategies directed to the Washington office have on his or her decision? And for those of you who might remember, the number one answers were a contact from a constituent's representative. 46% of congressional staff said that would have a lot of influence. And an in-person visit from constituents, 54%, which we are now correlating to a virtual visit via either phone call directly or through a video chat. And so that is still the number one way. So mixing up your tools when meeting and when interacting with Congress is going to be essential, especially in the first 6 months of 2021, when we are still dealing with semi-lockdown situations in state capitals and in the US Capitol. Now, I promised you a little bit of information about COVID-19 and the impact it's having, at least on the Congress. I shared in our last presentation on November. Let me share with you a little more data about what we think the future will be like in 21 and 22. Some of you may recall we did an extensive survey of congressional staff this past summer in June and July. And one of the questions we asked them went like this: looking to the future and the long-term impact of the COVID-19 crisis is likely to have on your office operations, please indicate whether you expect to increase, decrease, or keep the same amount of time and resources dedicated to the following. And this is what we found out, is we don't see a lot of increase or decrease on the responding to 4 messages from grassroots advocacy campaign. So they think they're going to send about the same amount of time. But when it comes to providing constituent services such as casework, outreach, fieldwork, 37% of congressional offices think they will increase this, which means they're going to be more available. And they're going to be setting up systems to be more available in the district or states. They also are expecting to conduct more telephone town hall meetings. We're going to talk more about that later in the program, because this is a new and dynamic and very constructive way to build relationships with lawmakers, but you have to know how to do it. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. That's one of the tools we'll be talking about later in today's program. We also see, quite unsurprisingly, that 67% think they're going to decrease having in-person meetings in Washington. 53% think they're going to decrease having in-person meetings in the district or state. And a whopping 77% said they're going to be engaging with individuals remotely, and that's an increase. And you can see this is where the big change is coming, especially in the first 6 months of 2021, before there's a vaccine and before things are safe again for people to have in-person interactions in public places like Washington and Austin. So that's the context of today's program regarding the Citizen Advocates Toolkit. Our agenda is we're going to break them down into 3 categories. There are tools that are related to congressional information and planning. There are tools related to communications, and there are tools related to in-state interactions. And we're going to break down 9 different tools. And the reason this program is so popular with our audiences is it's very practical guidance. This is something that you literally are going to be able to take away tomorrow and begin to start using some of these tools. Some may take a little more time to get used to and comfortable using, and most of these you're going to be familiar with, but what we're going to do is give you a little more of the how to build out the more robust tool set in a way that makes you and your other realtors more influential in the legislative process at the state and federal level. We'd also want to encourage you, if you want to ask questions, we have time for Q&A at the end of the session. Just go ahead and start asking questions in the chat box. We'd love to take those. We'll make sure before we come up to the 3 o'clock hour that we have an opportunity to answer those questions. And Seth and I are going to jointly go back and forth offering these various tools for you as you think about how you are going to increase your influence as a citizen advocate. The first set of category of tools falls under the category of congressional information and planning tools. And what we mean here is by becoming more knowledgeable about the legislators and the legislative process, you are going to be more influential. And the first tool we want to coach you to try to develop is what we call a legislator profile, where you're going to do some research on the legislator. Now, we're not asking you to be a lobbyist, but we are asking you to know a little bit about the legislator before you interact with them. And here's a data point that illustrates the need for this. In one of our surveys of congressional staff, 78% of legislative assistants and legislative directors said constituents frequently do not know the legislator's committee assignments. This is just a basic piece of research you can get off their website. One chief of staff said this in an open-ended answer: "It's disappointing when constituents and/or lobbyists come in for meetings and they are clueless about the congressman, district, and committee assignments." So what are we talking about here? We're not talking about extensive research. We simply want you to go do a Google search on the background of the members and the senators at the state and federal level. What was their professional background? We often say at the CMF that members of Congress bring their jobs with them. Their personalities, their background are defined usually by their profession. They are also influenced by their spouse's profession. It's always a good idea to know if the spouse has some connection to your industry. Do you know if perhaps the spouse worked in real estate? That's a big deal. Do the kids work in real estate? And of course, what are their committee assignments? And just have a place for writing this down. It can be a simple spreadsheet. And I think some people are daunted by this and they think, well, how am I going to create some kind of system? Well, let me give you a great case study in I think the first CRM, the first database of Congress. I was going to an event on Capitol Hill for the Sewell Belmont House. The Sewell Belmont House is the home of the National Women's Party. So this is where women's suffrage happened. It's a beautiful old home right next to the Hart Senate office building. And this event was on the ceiling, on the roof of the Hart building. And I go by and I saw this photograph right here. And I'm looking at this and it says, here hides Congress's record on women's suffrage. And there was a little note card that had one members of Congress record, name, party, hometown, wife's name, wife's hometown, wife's position on women's suffrage. And it went into this card catalog. And I said, holy cow, I found the first database on Congress. And I think this year, as we celebrate the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, I thought it was fun to kind of share with you that this is not that hard, that you can build it. It can be a simple spreadsheet, but it can also be something more extensive where you go into do a little more research. Go look at some of the news articles that have been written about the member of Congress, maybe some of the early news articles that were written about them. So there is this information available easily on the internet. Our first tool is a legislative profile. Seth's going to walk you through the very important second tool.
Thanks, Brad. And one thing I just might add to this about the database piece is that, or having a place to store your information, is we just did a survey this year of professional advocates. And one of the questions that we asked them is, when most professional advocates have access to a legislative platform that, a grassroots advocacy platform that allows them to do a number of different things. Now, about 97% of them all said that they use those platforms to send those mass email campaigns out, but almost only about half of them said that they used the other features, including, the features that allow them to track activities. So one of the other things that I would also note in that storage system is you also want to note any types of interactions that you personally have had with those members of Congress, or also interactions that people within your network may have had with them. That can be really, really influential. And because so few people actually do that, it really helps for you to stand out. So the next tool that we're going to talk about today is staff. It's really important to connect with a member's staff, or whether it's a member of Congress or a member of the state legislature, or even if somebody who's in a city council or something like that. You want to be able to connect with their staffs. Now, when it comes to Congress, here are some of the key positions that you want to connect with. You want to think about chiefs of staff. We have district directors or state directors, incredibly important people, legislative directors. That's the person in the Washington office, and then legislative assistants. And we're going to talk a little bit more about them a little bit later. But here are some things when you're looking to do some research on these different staffers. There are a few different places that you can go to learn a little bit more about them. The first one is there's this thing, it's called Google. I think that's also going to stick around. You can just Google the legislator's name and staff titles, and you might be able to find them in that way. Another thing that you can do is just simply pick up this really antiquated piece of technology called a telephone and call the member's office. And if you're looking to communicate with the legislative assistant, for example, who has housing on their portfolio or community development on their portfolio, you can just call and ask the person who answers the phone, who's the person that covers that issue, and they'll be able to give you that information. And then lastly, of course, you can contact the national office for information about those individuals. The national offices of almost every organization, they have subscriptions that give them access to some additional biographical information that they are more than able to and happy to pass along to you. So congressional staff, let's talk a little bit more specifically about congressional staff. And here are just a few data points about congressional staff. The first one is that is important to remember, is that the average age of a House legislative assistant is just 27 years old, but don't let the age fool you, because you're literally dealing with the NFL of legislators. We were on a webinar a couple of months ago with somebody who was a former staff person, and he was talking about when he was looking to fill a position of a freshman office, and he actually showed us an old newspaper article from about him in roll call, where he was sitting in front of 1,500 resumes to fill one position. So you can see that the person who you're engaging it with, even if they're 27 years old or perhaps even less, that is somebody who beat out a lot of people to get that job. Here's another thing to keep in mind about staff people. The average number of meetings that any House office hosts in a given week is 28 meetings a week. A day. Actually, it's 28 meetings a day that a staff person that offices host. And so they have a lot of different meetings. They're not just sitting there on the phone, but they're also engaging in a lot of different meetings with a lot of different individuals. Here are some more things to think about when it comes to staff. 23% say that they frequently or somewhat frequently experience rudeness when they meet with constituents. And you might think, well, how on earth does that happen? Well, here's one way that this can happen. A lot of times people come in and they see a staff person and they look at their age, or maybe they're disappointed in the person that they meet with, and they say something like, I thought my meeting was with my representative. And then maybe they might even say something even further like that. I don't want to meet with just staff, right? And of course, that's going to put into the staff person's mind, what the heck is going on here? What the hell? I'm a staff person, and they really do see themselves as public servants. And so when a constituent comes in and kind of has that type of an attitude, it can definitely come across as rude. So who are the staff people that you really need to get to know and build a relationship with? We wanted to know that too. So we, in a survey, asked this question right here. We asked, in thinking about constituents and the groups that represent them, such as associations, nonprofits, companies, what should they do more or less of to build relationships with your office and your member or senator? And so here's what we found. So here is the typical kind of office structure here. And a lot of people might think it's the chief of staff or a scheduler. Those people might be important to build relationships with. As you can see here, 23% of staff that we surveyed said that a chief of staff is important for building a relationship, and only 25% said that about the scheduler. Now, that's not to say that they don't serve important roles in the office, because they certainly do. These are incredibly important people in the office, and they're definitely important people not to tick off, but they're just not the most important people to build relationships with. Who are, though? So what one is that state or district director, 62% of staff said that it's really important for constituents to build relationships with the state or the district director. Now, a lot of people kind of discount the state or district directors because, they don't work in the Washington office. But think about it. Here's a few things to think about with a state director or a district director. One, they tend to have the longest tenure of any staff person. The average tenure of a House district director is about 11 years, where the average tenure of a House legislative assistant is about 1.5 years or so. The other thing is that they really have their member of Congress's ear, because when a member of Congress is thinking about who are they going to hire for, like, the chief of staff or district director, for, let's say, they think about who knows Capitol Hill, who understands the political process. When they think about hiring the district director, they're thinking about, who am I willing to get, stuck in the car with in a snowstorm driving down Interstate 40, right? So they really do. They kind of hire somebody that they really know and trust and don't mind spending a lot of time with. And then lastly, of course, these are people that are right there in your district. You might bump into them while you're pumping gas at the Circle K, for say, and maybe on a Friday evening. And I'll tell you, if you bump into a person and you ask them, what's the position on that, that issue that we talked about last week with the legislative assistant, they may not know the answer, but I guarantee you, when they're driving when you're driving away from the Circle K, they're on the phone with the office asking for a position, because they don't want to bump into you at the Circle K next Friday night and not have the answer to your question. And then Brad already showed you this one. Legislative directors, 79% of staff say the legislative director or the legislative assistants, those that have your issues on their portfolio are incredibly important to get to know from a relationships perspective, because these are the people that really understand your issues. They're the ones that really know where the rubber hits the road. Members of Congress only have a little bit of time to really think and concentrate on your issues. They need to really be experts on your issues. So really important people to get to know and build a relationship with, and help them to be able to do their job better and represent you better. Okay, so when it comes to, like, let's now talk about meetings with Congress, because we talked about, you know, a little bit about the rudeness and stuff. So first, you know, obviously we're in the era of where everybody seems to be feeling like they're, you know, playing one of the characters in you know, one of my old favorite sitcom shows from when I was a kid, The Brady Bunch. I think that probably would have made me Bobby. You know, I was kind of a bratty little guy myself. So what are some video conferencing tips? Well, first off is, what platforms do they use? And when it comes to the House, it's Microsoft Teams is kind of the official video conferencing platform of the House of Representatives. In the Senate, of course, they have to be different, so they use WebEx. And a lot of people ask us, well, what about Zoom? And they are using Zoom. It's not recommended by sort of the technical administrators in both the Senate and the House, but we know that they are still using that and other platforms as well. But these two, the Microsoft Teams and WebEx, those are kind of the official web platform or video conferencing platforms that they use. Let's also kind of move on to just some video conferencing tips. You know, we always have tips for just sort of meeting tips, but there are also some good tips to think of some additional things that you need to think about when you're having a meeting through video conferencing. The first thing is it's really important to use a good microphone. There's just nothing worse than when the microphone sounds all static and you can't hear what I'm saying through all the static and all that stuff. Using a quality microphone, even if it's just grabbing some earbuds from your iPhone or something like that, is much better than the internal microphone in your laptop. It just has a lot of you get a lot of ambient noise and it sounds really tinny. And when people can't understand what you're really having a hard time hearing what you're saying, everything else kind of goes out the window. The next one is you want to basically kind of like simulate eye contact. The first thing you want to do is you want to raise the webcam to eye level. This is not a very flattering view of anybody. It's certainly not a very flattering view of me as you're kind of looking straight up my nose here. So if you're working on a laptop, raise the camera up to eye level so that you don't end up having this really unflattering angle that you're looking at. The next one is you want to simulate eye contact, and here you see I'm in a video conference right here where I'm looking at the kind of the participant grid. But because I don't have the camera kind of in the same direction as that screen, it looks like I'm multitasking, and it doesn't look like I'm looking at people in the eye. So you want to simulate that eye contact by positioning that camera up kind of near where the grid is, the participant grid is. So it looks like you're looking into the camera versus looking away and multitasking. Nothing says, I don't care than somebody who's not looking at giving them eye-to-eye contact. The next thing that you want to think about is to dress the part. I know that, I tend to, we've been doing this COVID thing for quite a while here, and we all are getting a little bit casual perhaps, but wearing a t-shirt in a video conference with a member of Congress is definitely not something that you want to do. And then lastly, let's think about this. You want to set the stage of your room, right? Like, look, there's a pile of dirty laundry there in the background of this picture. Definitely not something that you want to do. So if you can't clean up the room and move the pile of laundry, you might even want to think about using like a virtual background. It's not hard to do. I mean, I was able to make a virtual background that with a CMF kind of background in about 5 minutes using just PowerPoint. Okay, and then lastly, when it comes to the last tip, when it comes to having influential meetings and effective meetings with congressional offices, it's really also important to do your follow through. If some of you, I'm sure many of you are golfers. I'm a lousy golfer myself, but I know the fact that if you don't have good follow through, the ball is not going to go where you want it to go. And there's the same thing for when you have bad follow through on a meeting. And it's unfortunate, but a lot of staffers have told us that a lot of constituents don't do a good job in following up after their meetings. We asked this question in a survey of staff. We asked this one that said, do constituents or their organizations generally follow up with you in a helpful or timely manner? And what we found was that Only 15% agreed with that. And that means 85% of the staff that responded to that survey said that people could do a better job in following up after their meetings. Here's a quote from a House legislative director that I think really makes the case, probably even a little bit more candidly than that great graph that we just showed you. So it goes like this. She said, if there's an ask to sign on to a bill or to sign on to a letter, especially something with a deadline, and then I never hear about it again, to me, I'm wondering how much of a priority is that to the group. When you think about that, if you don't send a follow-up, you actually still send a follow-up message. It's just not the message that you want that person to receive. It says, the message you just sent there is, I just wasted your time on something I don't actually care about. And so think about that when it comes to following up. And one of the best things that you can do to make sure that you do good follow-up is before your meeting, put it on your schedule that you're going to do the follow-up before you even have the meeting. Block an hour or so of your on your calendar after the meeting to make sure that you do that follow-up, and then don't let anybody else schedule anything else over it. Okay, we're going to go move on to the next set of tools, which is communications tools, and Brad's going to take it away from here.
Thanks, Seth. So the first communications tool we want you to think about is identifying the economic impact or the political footprint that your industry or you as a company, as an organization, or even as an individual have in that legislator's district or state. Now, the great thing is both the Texas Association of Realtors and the National Association of Realtors provide you with a lot of really good tools because we've been working with your groups for the last decade or so. So we know that there is some great tools available. And it could be everything from the number of people who are in your industry or the number of buyers and sellers or the value in dollars of revenue. And what are the multiplier effects? You guys are really good at talking about the multiplier effects of home ownership. I remember people talking to me about anytime I move into a house, how much money is spent on renovation afterwards, how many electricians and carpenters and other workers are employed when someone moves into a new home. So look for those multiplier effects that you can talk about in a little bit more detail. And I'll say also, the multiplier effects don't have to be positive. They can even be negative. We've done a lot of talk about the impact of not having a national flood insurance program. What are the multiplier effects of that on home ownership and the lack of ability to have certainty, especially those people that are in floodplains. So think about that. And obviously you're going to be talking about the benefit to the taxpayer. You're going to give it to them in language that they can understand, the legislator can understand that if you did not do X, Y would happen to the legislator. And just to show you how this kind of description of an economic impact or footprint can have on a congressional office, a staff member, or a state lawmaker, we got a survey back from a group that actually was surveying the participants. These are the citizen advocates who went to these meetings, and they showed them the economic impact in this particular meeting. And one of our trainees, the citizen advocate trainees, came back with a quote like this: just left a meeting with Representative so-and-so's office. He stated the congressman was a supporter. He was blown away and shocked to see a map. He said, this just makes it real. And you would be shocked at the number of people that walk into a meeting with a state legislator or a member of Congress with just some talking points and handouts that are not strong. Not everybody has, frankly, the support of your state and national association. You guys are one of the more sophisticated groups out there. So take advantage of that, and it will allow you to separate your message from others. So what else are they looking for, and why is this valuable? Well, some of you may remember from the August presentation, we shared with you the answers to this question right here. How helpful is it for messages from constituents to include the following? And what we found in the really helpful category, first 91% said information about the impact the bill would have on the district or state would be helpful or somewhat helpful. And 79% said a personal story related to the bill or issue will be helpful or somewhat helpful. They also want to know the reasoning, and they like to know, of course, what your specific ask is. But here's a data point that we didn't share with you. In our last survey of congressional staff, in addition to asking the question, how helpful is it for messages from constituents to include the following, we then asked this follow-up question: how frequently do messages from constituents include the following? You see where we're going here? If you have something that's really helpful, but it's not frequently delivered to lawmakers and politicians. That's going to differentiate. Now, by the way, we use the term, how frequently do messages from constituents include? We also tested out social media. We tested out in-person meetings, and we got the same top answers when we asked the question a different way. And this is what we found out. While 91% of congressional staff say it would be helpful or somewhat helpful to have information on the impact the bill would have on the district or state, only 9% said they get it frequently or very frequently. Where 8 out of 10 staffers say that a personal story is good, only 2 out of 10 say they get it frequently or very frequently. You see where we're going with this? This differentiates you. If you walk into a meeting with a politician and you have information about the impact of the bill on the district or state, or a personal story related to the bill or issue, it's going to make an impact. And you don't even need the chart. You may need just to have a way of illustrating this. And I'll give you one example from another group I work with. This was a medical professional group I was training, and it was right after the passage of the Affordable Care Act in 2010. And this woman came up to me and said, "Oh, I'll tell you how it worked in my meeting. I went to the meeting in Washington, and I sat down with the congressman, and his aide was there, and I explained it to him this way. I said, Congressman, if you vote for this amendment, your constituents are going to have to drive farther and pay more money to get the same procedure they get today." And the congressman turned to his aide and said, "We're done. What's next?" That's what they mean about the impact on the district or state. Said another way by a legislative assistant in one of our surveys, my boss rarely asks if there isn't an impact on his district. Show me a connection as to how your issue directly affects our constituents. So this shows you that if you have that information and you're able to demonstrate the impact, you're definitely going to make a connection to that lawmaker and demonstrate to them that this is important to them. Seth's going to walk you through the next one of the most challenging and important tools available in a Citizen Advocate's Toolkit, the ability to email congressional staff. Seth?
Thanks, Brad. Well, I've talked a little bit about staff already, but here's another little data point that I didn't share with you, and that is it's important to keep in mind that congressional staff, they receive on average in any given day about 150 to 300 emails per day. And these aren't the types of spam and swipe left kind of emails. These are the types of emails that are like read it and you're fired, or you're fired emails, which is why it's pretty common to see, a scene like this, what's this guy holding in his hand right there is, obviously he's reading his email on his mobile device. And so it's really important that when you are emailing with congressional staff to keep in mind, that they get so many different emails and they're trying to catch up with it, that you really want to make sure that you write your emails effectively. So for example, here's an example of what it looks like if you send an email where there's this, lots and lots and lots of text. It's this paragraph after paragraph. You can see here that that's just an overwhelming thing to look at. And you go, oh, geez, this is going to take me forever to read and get through. I don't want to read this, and you're going to move on, right? You're not going to, and you might miss something really important as well. So you want your emails to look more like this. Look at this email right here. You've got a really clear subject line. It's got bullets, it's got attachments, and you can see the signature there, from a good constituent, that it's the text doesn't just run off below the end of the screen, right? It's you can tell okay, I can read this email in pretty quickly and move on. That is what a good email should look like. The other thing to keep in mind is, and I noted there before, is that members of congressional staff, they have these portable mobile devices sort of surgically implanted in their hands. I mean, think about what that long email looks like when you're reading that on a mobile device. My wife, I love her to death, but I'll just admit something. Actually, she's around the corner, so I'll say this more quietly. But so I often don't read her text, because she sends me like 400-word texts. And then I get home and she says, "Did you read my text?" And I'm like, no, it was 400 words long. So you don't want your text to look really, or your emails to look really overwhelming like that, right? You want them to also be short and concise. And so when you look at it, here's an example of what that shorter email looks like on a portable mobile device there. And you can see that that's not nearly as overwhelming. So, you really want to keep in mind to, sort of the platform. Subject line's important. Attachments are really helpful. Keeping it short and concise it's all really important to keep in mind, and also in mind, what device that they might be reading that email from. Brad, you're going to take our next tool.
The next tool is probably one of the most effective citizen advocate tools and most underutilized tool in a citizen advocate toolkit, and that is the letter to the editor. Now, you may say, I'm not going to influence a lot of people with a letter to the editor. Well, you're going to influence one person, and that's going to be the lawmaker, because if you write a letter to the editor and you reference the lawmaker in the letter, I guarantee you that lawmaker is going to see that letter to the editor. I remember I worked as a Senate press secretary for 5 years in the United States Senate, and every day we had to prepare what was called the clip packet for the member of Congress. And back in the 90s, it actually was, paper, and we Xerox it off and send it into him. And I could send, the clips were always done in the same order. On top were any articles that referenced him by name, the better ones, maybe a photo would be on top. And then in the bottom, there'd be the letters to the editor that would reference them. If I sent it a packet that, let's say the biggest paper in the state said the dude walked on water, but the littlest paper in the state had a letter to the editor complaining that we didn't get a pothole fixed, what do you think I caught back from the senator circled in red saying, get this done? It was a letter to the editor. And I never understood if he meant fix the pothole or fix the letter. To this day, I don't know what he meant. But the point is that it's going to get under their skin. In fact, if you talk to politicians, they think letters to the editor are more influential than actual editorials, because editorials come from editors who have political biases, but letters to the editors come from voters. They come from citizens. So what are we talking about? Well, I'm going to actually show you an example of a letter to the editor that was literally published just 2 weeks ago that referenced a lawmaker in his local paper. This was the Kit Sap Sun in the state of Washington. And you can see the headline was about Congressman Kilmer. Kilmer's part of an effort to fix Congress. And you might note who the writer was. It was me. I actually sent in a letter to the editor. It was a new experiment we tried at CMF, and it worked great. And this is what happens when you reference a letter to the editor that mentions the member of Congress in a positive way. Look what Congressman Kilmer did. He put me into his Twitter feed, and he thanked me and the Congressional Management Foundation for our work. In this particular case, he is the chairman of the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress, and he's actually made a lot of really good recommendations on how to improve the United States Congress, and we thought that was worthy of praise. You could do the same thing. If you've got a lawmaker, a state lawmaker, and you send that in, it would be it's like an incredible thank you note that members just don't get. So here are some tips when you're writing a letter to the editor. First, reference a story, if you can, from an article that ran in the paper during the last week. Now, you may not have that opportunity, but if there is something, you've got a state legislative session that's going to be coming up in just about 45 days. There's going to be a lot of news that's running in both your local papers and also in some of the bigger state papers about what's going on. Keep an eye out for that. If there's anything that references taxes or issues that you're working on, be ready to do that. Keep the letters short, about 100 to 200 words. Every website for a news organization, for a newspaper, has a letter to the editor section. It's all done by web. You got to just plug it in there. And consider referencing the lawmaker is a must. You've got to reference it, because that means it's going to get into the lawmaker's hands. And by the way, let's say you're in a big city like Houston or Dallas, and the idea of getting, something published in the Houston Chronicle is just not likely, right? Well, how can you still get credit for that? What you do is when you write that letter to the editor and you submit it to the newspaper, cut and paste a copy and send it to a staff member of the legislator and say, hey, I just wanted to give you a heads up that we're writing this letter to the editor regarding this issue. Hopefully it's something that you're not bashing them really aggressively on, and it's you're neutral or thanking them. Because when you do that, you are sending a powerful message to that politician. You're saying, I have a megaphone and I know how to use it. And maybe you don't get this letter published, but you're going to get another one published. I can tell you, folks, I worked on Capitol Hill for 4 members of Congress for 13 years. That happened to me 3 times when I got that letter to the editor. And every time I took the letter unpublished and walked into the member's office and said, look at what we got here. Now, in 2 cases, it was positive, and 1, it was negative. And we just had a higher degree of respect for that citizen advocate. In all cases, they were associated with an association or nonprofit or company in the district or state. So they already had some standing with us. But the point is that it's a great way to get the attention of a lawmaker. And as I said, it is the most powerful, underutilized tool in a citizen advocate's toolkit. Next, we're going to talk about social media. Seth?
Thanks, Brad. So social media, when we talk about social media, I know that there are lots of different social media platforms out there, but when it comes to members of Congress and policymakers, they're really pretty much 2. And so that's Facebook. And then there's also this new thing called Facebook Town Hall, which is a new kind of technology and platform offered by Facebook that allows people to gather in kind of smaller groups for free and to have a kind of a town hall conversation for free. And a lot of members of Congress are using this in order to communicate with kind of groups of constituents about kind of smaller groups of constituents about specific issues. Now, the one thing is that the people do have to be members of Facebook, so there is that. But that is also a tool that is helpful for engaging with members of Congress in what's called a kind of a virtual town hall. So there's a social media platform as well. And then, of course, we're talking about Twitter. And sometimes this is starting to catch on a little bit more as Instagram. Okay, so social media, we kind of wanted to know, how do you get your posts and how do you kind of get noticed in using social media? So we asked this question to communications directors. It went like this. If your member of Congress has not arrived at a firm decision on an issue, how much influence might social media posts directed to your office from the following have on his or her decision? And we listed a number of things and we'll share them with you now. So constituent not affiliated with a specific group or cause, 59% said that has some influence. A constituent affiliated with a specific group or cause has some or a lot of influence. But here's where it starts to kind of pick up. Multiple constituents not affiliated with a specific group, but multiple constituents affiliated with a specific group, with 78% saying that has some or a lot of influence. That's how you're going to get your messages noticed. So if you're a realtor and you have 9 realtor friends in your area that can coordinate with you and send multiple messages, similar messages, all kind of signaling that they're all engaged with the National Association of Realtors or the Texas Realtors, that is a way for you to be able to really get those messages noticed. Another group of really influential people in ways to get that also get noticed in social media. I know that communications directors often will they look for any kind of tweets or posts from kind of VIP individuals as well. Here's a story that kind of illustrates why that's important and how that's really important to do is if you are a VIP when you're using social media. So several years ago, there was a food bank in sort of one of the western states in the United States that attended one of our trainings and decided to tweet at their member of Congress. And so what they did is they sent out a tweet at that, before a markup about potential cuts to the SNAP program, or what's commonly thought of as a food stamps program. So, sent this tweet. And the legislative director ended up calling him up within about an hour, and they say, "Hey, what's going on here? Food banks don't advocate." And the response that the food bank representative told the legislative director was, "Well, we do now." I mean, you got to think about that. One tweet can really make a lot of difference. So the next time that there was something that was coming out about cuts to food stamp or something that involved the food stamps program, you want to know what happened? Well, before the markup happened, the legislative director actually called the food stamps representative and said, "Hey, by the way, there's new legislation proposing changes to the SNAP program. What do you think?" I mean, so you got to think about that. Just one tweet. And brought them from being, sort of on the table to being at the table. And that is really, I think, a great illustration and a great story about how using social media effectively can really make a difference. Now Brad's going to talk to us some more about in-state interaction tools.
Thanks, Seth. This is the last section we're going to go through in the last few tools before we go to Q&A. But our research has shown from when we started doing this over 20 years ago that in-state interaction tools are often overlooked, that people think it has to happen at the state capitol or in Washington, D.C. And that is absolutely not the case, that in-state interactions can actually be more influential. And the reason we know that is from this survey question we've been asking for over 15 years of congressional staff. In your opinion, how important is each for understanding the constituents' views and opinions? And if you look at the top of this chart, that the 98 and 99%, it's meetings between staff and constituents, communications from reps, attending events in the district or state, meetings with the members. I mean, these are all things that can happen back in the home state. So we're going to walk you through 3 more tools that are available to you before we go to the Q&A. The first isn't available to you right now, but it will be, it looks like, in about 6 to 8 months if the vaccines are successful. And I do want to make a note about in-person town hall meetings. And I'm going to give you a firsthand account. As some of you heard, I worked on Capitol Hill for 13 years. My first job was a press secretary for a member of the House of Representatives from Maryland. We represented basically the DC line up until the Baltimore City line and all the way to Annapolis. Because I was his press secretary, when he had a town hall meeting in Glen Burnie or Howard County or Arundel County, I would go to those meetings because there often would be media there. So I spent my first 4 years getting the best political education a young person could get by watching about 100 town hall meetings that members of Congress, my boss, had with constituents. And you think these things are crowded or they're messy. If they actually have a meeting, it's usually going to be about 10 or 15 people. The first town hall meeting I went to in Annapolis, Maryland, was at a middle school, and they moved it from the gym to a conference room because only 12 citizens came. And this 12 people sat for 90 minutes with their member of Congress. I mean, that's something that's really rare and is a great opportunity. So when it does come back, keep in mind these tips for in-person town hall meetings. Be prepared. Know your material in advance. Get the information from the state or the federal office on what the talking point is. Go a little early, 5-10 minutes early, and meet staff. As you saw earlier, as Seth pointed out, the district director is one of the most influential characters in a congressional office. They are almost always at every in-person town hall meeting. So go in groups too. You know, nothing says listen to me like a very small mob. And so a group, by the way, is 2. That's a lot at a town hall meeting. 5 is even better. 10 is definitely something that'll get their attention. Leave some paper behind if you can. Drop something off. So they'll take that piece of paper and they'll scan it and send it to the legislative assistant. And almost as important as everything else is provide feedback to the professional advocate, to the lobbyist at your state level or your federal level. Again, I'll give you an anecdote. One person came, a lobbyist who I knew. I was chief of staff for a freshman lawmaker, and this lobbyist came in after one of our town hall meeting series. It was during the April recess. And it was about 3 weeks later. And this woman comes in and says, "Hi, Brad, how you doing?" "Oh, great, great." She said, "By the way, I know at that town hall meeting that the Congresswoman had in Baraboo, someone asked about our issue, and she said she would get back to that constituent about whether to co-sponsor our bill. I just want to know what I should tell her." I was so blown away that there was that closing of the loop and we were being held accountable. And you got to bet your bottom dollar that I went and found out about what happened at that meeting and got back to that lobbyist, and our district director got back to that constituent. And it was only because that constituent had told the lobbyist what happened in that interaction. That is just so rare. That happened one time in 13 years on Capitol Hill, but boy, it makes a big impression. Now, the big development that has happened as a result of the coronavirus is the explosion of telephone and online town hall meetings. As you saw earlier, we're seeing significant numbers. This is only going to increase in 21 than 2020. This is what we're hearing. In 2020, obviously, no one predicted the coronavirus was going to push Congress out of town. And it happened on March 13th after, of course, we were already well into the fiscal year. Well, now congressional offices, as they build their 2021 budgets, are budgeting in much more money for telephone town hall meetings, which can cost anywhere from $5,000 to $10,000 a pop. So now they're going to be ready to have more telephone town hall meetings. We're going to show you a very quick clip right now, a video clip of an interview we did with Congressman Bill Hunzinger of Michigan. He's a former district director, by the way, so one of those former congressional staffers who's now a member of Congress. And we asked him about telephone town hall meetings. And this is what he said.
People push zero to ask their question. My staff is in there fielding those questions, and oftentimes there'll be a concern about a casework, something that's happening with people or a piece of legislation. We'll allow them to sort of handle that, and then they give us a little synopsis. And I don't just go for the softballs. I take the tough ones. I want to hear the critical ones, not just for my benefit, I think, but for others who are on the line. Who aren't maybe sure who is this guy, especially as a freshman. They're trying to figure out what I'm about, and I think it's important that that I answer not just the ones that I agree with philosophically, but that I allow those who disagree with me philosophically to have a run at me too.
Now, I know that's going to sound very rare, but I got to tell you, that is the philosophy of most members of Congress in these telephone town hall meetings. They want to demonstrate that they're listening to everybody. Now, I'm going to go over some tips for those of you who are in the August session. This is a repeat of what you already heard, but I got to tell you, getting a question into one of these telephone town hall meetings is such an important way to hold the lawmaker accountable. So I'm going to go over these rules again. First, try to get invited. Sign up to the legislators' e-newsletter. That's a good way to get invited. They often invite all the subscribers. Always ask a question. You've got to do this almost immediately. Average telephone town hall meeting has 5,000 people on it, and they only get through about 10 questions. So try to get that question in. Know that you're going to have your question vetted. You'll go in a virtual room. Again, they're not trying to censor you. They just want to make sure you're not going to swear at the lawmaker and scream. Recognize you're on a very big stage. These things are getting bigger and bigger, especially in the age of coronavirus. Establish your credentials for the audience. Always reference that you're a member of the Texas Association of Realtors. Always, always, always. As you saw from the research earlier on social media, establishing your connection to a well-known state or national association increases your power as a citizen advocate. I recommend talking from a written question. If I'm on that biggest stage, I'm going to do it. And it'd be nice if you just praise the lawmaker, even if it's for just listening. That's going to really go a long way to establishing your credibility as a reasonable constituent. The last tip we're going to offer, again, not probably available for a while, but it's going to district events. It's inviting the lawmaker to your town, to your business, to where you do your work as a real estate agent. And the thing that happens when they go to these events is they almost always are going to get their photograph taken, and then they're going to become your champion. They're going to promote your issues on social media, on their website. So use these events when it becomes available to you in 2021. Think about how you're going to use those events to amplify your voice and have people understand what's important to you and your industry. With that, we're going to go to Q&A, and Seth and I will turn back on our videos. And actually, I'll probably just sort of move on to the next slide so you have a little more data about the Congressional Management Foundation. And I'll go back, turn it to Joanna, and see if we have any questions.
We do. We have two questions. They are both from Sonia Powers, and they are in the chat. Sonia asks, when you send a letter to the editor, how should you write the letter? In other words, should you sign it as a constituent or as the organization you represent, such as your local board or Texas Realtors?
Local board or Texas Realtors. That's going to instantly resonate with the editors and the people that are reviewing that, because you're not just speaking for yourself, you're speaking for other people in the industry. And frankly, if it's referencing something that was already in the paper, they're going to have a really good reason not to publish it, especially if it's a smaller or mid-sized paper. If it's, again, the Dallas Morning News is a little different, because they're getting thousands and thousands of letters to the editor. But if it's a local issue, if it's something that was just referenced in the paper, you got a really good chance of getting published.
And I can take the next one, Brad. The other question that Sonia had was this one. How influential are calls to action with lawmakers since they are form letters, albeit a large amount of form letters? And, one thing to keep in mind is, so, now the National Association of Realtors, I mean, that's a large group. So they have the ability to, generate large volumes of email. But we did a survey of legislative correspondents, and those are the people that are in the in offices that answer the mail. They're the ones in the mailroom. And we asked them a question of like, how many emails, form email messages does it take to get out of the mailroom? Basically to get enough there where they realize like, hey, there's a campaign here that's got some legs, and they elevate it to either the legislative director or the legislative assistant with that issue on their portfolio. And what we found was it's about 100 to 150 emails that each campaign needs to generate. So, you think about that. When I worked at Goodwill, I was happy if I got, 150 emails for the whole doggone campaign, let alone to one individual office. And so, it does take a large amount of emails, but if you personalize those messages, or if you note that you're a person who is a VIP, then that number comes down quite a bit. And so even if you get a call to action, personalize your message, spend the 5 minutes to just do a little bit more personalization. That will help that email message to have a lot more influence. Another one thing to keep in mind is that organizations, sometimes they get requests from congressional offices themselves that they need to get some emails generated so that member of Congress, because they want to do the right thing, but they want to be able to have some political cover. And so those campaigns sometimes will be requested from offices so that they can get that covered and get those emails generated. Brad, do you have anything to add to that?
I want to emphasize, if you get an email from Joanna asking you for an action alert, please act on it. Yeah. So we don't want you to get the wrong impression, but it literally goes into a different pile. And I can tell that both from working on Capitol Hill and also working with lawmakers for the last 15 years on this. It literally, when you say, I'm with the Texas Realtors, boom, you're different. You're just treated completely differently than the rest of the constituents that are just John Q. Public. Also, you got an interest here, not just an opinion, and that goes a long way. So just personalizing it just a little bit. If you get an action alert and just putting a couple of lines at the beginning that in El Paso, this is the impact of not having flood insurance, or in Austin, this is, just talk about it a little bit from your perspective, from your local perspective. And our research shows that the total number that needs to get their attention is less than 10. So if you get 5 or 7 realtors that are going to send it in all around the same time, it makes a huge difference. With that, we're going to turn it back to Joanna because I know we're coming up to time.
Yes, I have one more point of clarification here. The letters to the editors are great. I would encourage y'all, if you would need help writing that, please contact your government affairs staff so we can help you. We have some great people on our staff who can assist you with any policy positions or clarifications for your letter to the editor. And there was another question about Hill visits in person in May. I'm not sure about that. I guess we will see. However, I do have an update that most likely we'll be doing some sort of virtual event for Realtor Day at the Capitol. So this is why I'm really focusing on these trainings so that we can be prepared in any form or fashion that we take our Realtor Day to. With that, thank you both so much for being here and for all of the attendees that have joined us. And one more thing, I just want to make sure that y'all don't miss our calls for action. I wanted to plug our RPMA. It's a great way that you won't miss any of the calls for actions that we have. We only use it sparingly, and if you sign up by December 11th, you'll be entered to win $500. You can just text the word TX Realtors to 30644, and you'll be signed up. So this is a great way to answer those calls for actions that we were discussing. And with that, thank y'all so much. You will be receiving a link to the recording as well as a link for registration for the next session. Thank y'all so much for joining us.